The storm battered the penthouse glass, turning the panoramic view of the city into a chaotic gray abstraction. Inside, the silence was curated, a deliberate void of white noise and temperature control. Then my phone lit up, shattering the calm. A private flight had been grounded. The passenger was being diverted to my terrace access. I read the name on the security notification. Violet. The venture capitalist who had spent the last 6 months dismantling my company's valuation with the cold precision of a surgeon. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the opposition. The elevator doors slid open. My home is a sanctuary of precision. The furniture is low and Italian, the lighting is calibrated to a specific warmth, and the air is always cool. I was dressed for this solitude, wearing cashmere joggers and a silk camisole, bare feet silent on the heated floors. I wasn't dressed for a board meeting. But when the elevator doors parted, the boardroom arrived in my foyer. Violet stepped out, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. She brought the violence of the storm in with her. Her trench coat was soaked, the heavy fabric dark with rain, clinging to her frame. Water dripped from the hem, marking my pristine white marble floor with dark, intrusive spots. The sound of her heels was a sharp, aggressive staccato that echoed off the high ceilings. Click, click, click. She stopped 10 feet away, clutching a leather briefcase like a weapon. She looked wrecked, yet terrifyingly composed. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe, untouchable chignon, was loosening, damp strands plastered against her neck. But her eyes were the same, assessing, calculating, looking for the weakness in the structure. "The airport is closed," she said. "No hello, no apology for the intrusion, just the facts, delivered with the efficiency of a quarterly report." "I heard," I replied, crossing my arms. I felt exposed in the silk, underdressed against her armor. "You're lucky the building management cleared the landing. Most of the city is dark." "Strategy," she corrected, her gaze sweeping over the open-concept living area. She was likely estimating the square footage and the cost of the art on the walls. "Always have a backup landing zone." Though I didn't expect the hostility of the weather to match the hostility of the host. The air between us thickened, charged with more than just the barometric pressure. We stood there, two women who had only ever communicated through lawyers and term sheets, now trapped in a glass box. "Can I take your coat?" I offered, the politeness feeling foreign, sharp in my mouth. "You're dripping on the travertine." She hesitated. Shedding the coat meant shedding a layer of defense. She unbuttoned it slowly, her fingers stiff from the cold. Underneath, she wore a structured charcoal suit that cost more than most cars, a silk blouse buttoned to the throat. It was high-status business armor, designed to intimidate. The visual contrast was a physical manifestation of our dynamic, her rigid capital against my fluid creativity. "The valuation meeting is Tuesday," she said, handing me the wet coat. She couldn't help it. Business was her default setting, her shield against the awkward intimacy of the situation. "If the city is still standing," I countered, taking the heavy, damp wool. It smelled of ozone and expensive perfume, santal and steel. "You can put the briefcase down, Violet. I'm not going to pitch you while you're shivering." She stiffened at the observation. "I'm not shivering." "You are." She walked to the window, turning her back on me to look out at the gray void. The rigid line of her posture was a study in tension. She was a woman used to controlling the flow of capital, the flow of meetings, the flow of her own life. Now she was grounded, at the mercy of the elements and her professional rival. "The infrastructure down there is failing," she murmured, watching the lights of the skyline flicker. "Inefficient." "It's a hurricane, not a bad quarterly review," I said, moving to the kitchen island to put distance between us. "You can't audit the weather." "I can assess the risk," she shot back, turning to face me. Her eyes were dark, tired, but unflinching. "And right now, the risk is high." The wind slammed against the glass then, a physical blow that made the steel frame of the building groan. The lights in the penthouse surged, bright, then dim, mirroring the sudden spike in my pulse. The storm was escalating, closing the distance between the outside chaos and the controlled silence of my home. The usual boundaries of our professional lives were dissolving, washed away by the rain. We were just two bodies in a high-altitude cage. Violet tapped the screen of her phone. the backlight casting a harsh, artificial glow on the sharp planes of her face. She was scrolling through logistics apps, her thumb moving with a frantic speed, looking for a loophole in the disaster. "The tunnel is underwater," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "The bridge is closed to commercial traffic. The airport is a parking lot." She looked up, and for a second, the professional mask slipped. She wasn't the VC who had just slashed my projected earnings by 20%. She was a woman, realizing the walls were closing in, stiff and fast. "I can't leave." "You can't," I confirmed. I moved to the kitchen, the distance between us feeling like a physical terrain I had to navigate carefully. "The roads are rivers, Violet. You're grounded." She didn't accept the defeat. Her phone buzzed, and she answered it instantly, bringing the device to her ear with a sharp, practiced motion. "I don't care about the liquidity issues," she snapped into the receiver. She turned her back to me, facing the storm, using the glass wall as a whiteboard for her frustration. "The valuation stands. If they want to renegotiate, they can wait until I'm back on the grid." "No, I said hold the line." I leaned against the kitchen island, watching the rigid line of her spine. In the boardroom, Violet was a monolith. She occupied space with a terrifying stillness, speaking in low tones that forced you to lean in, only to cut your legs out from under you with a single data point. But here, stripped of her team and her mahogany table, she was vibrating with nervous energy. She was trying to manage a crisis from a cell phone while standing in wet clothes. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but undeniably. Down on the street or in her corner office, she held the capital. She decided who ate and who starved. But up here, in the sky, I held the resources. I had the dry clothes, I had the shelter, I had the high ground. "We need to pivot the strategy," she said to the air, her hand gripping the phone so tight her knuckles were white. "The market is volatile." She was using the jargon as a shield, wrapping herself in the language of control because she had lost control of her physical reality. I took a sip of water, the cool glass sweating in my hand. I felt a strange, twisting satisfaction watching her struggle, mixed with an unexpected pang of empathy. We were both captains of industry, usually. But tonight, we were just passengers. Then the world outside changed. It started in the lower districts, a rolling wave of darkness that swallowed the city block by block. The grid was failing. I watched the lights of the skyline flicker and die, a domino effect of failure that raced toward us. The ambient glow of the city, the light pollution that usually turned the night sky a bruised purple, vanished. The storm had severed the last connection. "Violet," I said, my voice cutting through her call. She turned just as the darkness hit our building. The overhead recessed lighting blinked out. The hum of the refrigerator died. The low, constant vibration of the building's life support systems, the elevators, the pumps, the servers, cut out instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. It wasn't the curated quiet of my home. It was the dead silence of a machine that had stopped working. Violet lowered the phone, the screen now the only light source in the room, illuminating her wide eyes. The call had dropped. The signal was gone. "The generator?" she asked, her voice sounding too loud in the sudden stillness. "Emergency lights only," I said. "The main systems are down." Then the air changed. The subtle, expensive breeze of the climate control system stopped. The airflow that kept the penthouse a constant, crisp 68 degrees stagnated. The room began to feel smaller, the glass walls less like a window and more like the sides of a terrarium. The humidity from the storm outside seemed to press against the seals. The cage was locked, and the air was running out. The emergency LEDs buzzed to life with a harsh, clinical snap. They weren't the warm, ambient glow I had paid a lighting designer a fortune to calibrate. They were industrial strips recessed in the hallway, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. The penthouse, usually a gallery of soft textures and curated shadows, suddenly looked like a crime scene, or worse, a server room. It was ugly. It was exposed. Violet squinted against the glare, the blue-white light hollowing out her cheeks and making her look severe, almost gaunt. The atmosphere inside was no longer just heavy. It was suffocating. Without the low hum of the circulation systems, the air grew stagnant within minutes. The atmosphere thickened, becoming a physical weight that pressed against our temples. It smelled of her expensive perfume, santal and steel, mixing with the rising scent of anxiety. "I can't breathe in here," Violet said, pulling at the high collar of her silk blouse. It was the first time she'd admitted a physical need. She looked at the glass walls, which were now just black mirrors reflecting our own trapped expressions. "The air is dead." "The terrace," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a tactical necessity. "We need to open the door." I walked to the heavy sliding glass panels. Usually, they retracted with a silent, motorized hum at the touch of a button. Now, they were dead weight, a wall of transparency that refused to yield. I unlocked the manual latch and shoved. The glass fought me, heavy and stubborn. Violet moved next to me, her shoulder brushing mine, a brief electric contact of damp silk against cashmere, and added her weight to the frame. We pushed together, two rivals exerting force in the same direction for the first time in history. The seal broke with a hiss, and then the world roared. The sound was instantaneous and overwhelming. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed around the steel corners of the architecture. We stepped out onto the covered section of the balcony, a deep recess protected by the concrete overhang of the floor above. The sensory shift was violent. Inside, the air had been dead and warming. Out here, it was alive, freezing, and charged with the metallic taste of ozone and pulverized stone. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single step. The humidity vanished, replaced by a cold spray that misted our faces even in the shelter. We stood side by side, gripping the cold steel of the inner railing, looking out at the void. The city was gone. The sprawling, glittering grid of capital and ambition that we both spent our lives conquering had been erased. There were no skyscrapers, no traffic arteries, no illuminated logos of banks and tech giants. There was only the storm. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional jagged tear of lightning that illuminated the rain falling in sheets like gray curtains. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. The hierarchy of our existence, founder versus venture capitalist, builder versus dismantler, felt laughably small against the sheer scale of the atmospheric violence. Violet leaned forward, her hands white-knuckled on the rail. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring into the abyss where the financial district used to be. The wind whipped the loose strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't brush them away. "I hate this," she whispered. The wind almost stole the words, but I was close enough to hear the tremor in them. "The storm?" I asked, leaning closer to be heard over the gale. "The stop," she corrected. She turned her head, her eyes catching the faint reflection of the lightning, dark and searching. "I hate the stillness, being grounded. It feels like dying." It was a crack in the porcelain, a glimpse of the engine that drove her. She didn't dismantle companies because she was cruel. She did it because she was terrified of stagnation. She needed the velocity. "It's just a pause, Violet," I said, my voice softer than the wind demanded. "The market will open again." "Will it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Or does it just look like this when the lights go out?" She looked vulnerable then, stripped of her algorithms. The proximity between us felt dangerous, not because of the rivalry, but because in the dark, without the roles we played, we were just two women standing on the edge of the world. Then the wind shifted, a sudden, capricious change in direction. It hooked around the concrete pillar that shielded us. A gust of rain, cold and heavy, slapped against the terrace floor. The storm broke the boundary of the overhang with the sudden, violent breach of a dam. It wasn't a gradual encroachment. It was a hostile takeover of our small, sheltered square footage. The wind hooked around the concrete pillar that had been shielding us, carrying a sheet of rain that hit the terrace floor like a handful of thrown gravel. The spray was instantaneous, a cold, wet shock that slapped against our skin and soaked the hem of my pants in seconds. Logic dictated retreat. Inside the glass box, the air was stagnant and dead, but it was dry. Out here, the world was actively trying to drown us. Yet, neither of us moved toward the sliding door. There was a perverse safety in the chaos. The noise of the wind was so loud, it drowned out the awkward silence that had been suffocating us indoors. The violence of the weather felt honest, a relief after hours of polite, veiled threats about valuations and board seats. We stayed rooted to the spot, gripping the railing as the water pooled around our feet, choosing the freezing reality of the storm over the stifling intimacy of the living room. Then the wind shifted again, sharper this time, and the rain caught her. It didn't just mist her, it drenched her. I watched the water hit Violet with the indifference nature reserves for anything expensive. It soaked into her hair, destroying the severe architectural perfection of her chignon. The dark strands collapsed, plastered against her neck and cheeks, dripping water down the sharp line of her jaw. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath that was lost in the roar of the gale, and raised a hand to wipe the water from her eyes. The gesture was unguarded, raw. She pushed the wet hair back from her forehead, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. The rain had turned her silk blouse into a liability. The expensive fabric, usually a shield of corporate armor, was now dark and heavy, clinging to her skin with a suffocating intimacy. It adhered to her shoulders, outlining the tension held there, and plastered against her arms, exposing the goose flesh rising on her pale skin. She wasn't the venture capitalist anymore. She was just a woman standing in a hurricane, wearing clothes designed for a climate-controlled boardroom. "You're freezing!" I shouted. I had to pitch my voice to a scream just to bridge the 2 feet between us. The wind tore the words from my throat, stripping away any nuance or sarcasm. Violet turned to look at me, her face wet and pale in the darkness. She didn't try to posture. She didn't try to fix her hair or smooth the ruined blouse. She just blinked, the water catching on her lashes. "It's better than the quiet," she yelled back. Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual low, modulated control. The volume forced a kind of honesty we hadn't managed all night. You can't lie effectively when you have to scream to be heard. "You're shaking, Violet." I stepped closer, invading her personal space, because the storm had erased the concept of boundaries. "The temperature is dropping. You can't stand out here in wet silk." "I'm fine," she lied, but her teeth chattered on the last word, a sharp, involuntary click that betrayed her. She gripped the railing tighter, as if the steel could ground her against the shivering that was starting to rack her frame. I watched the tremor start at her shoulders and ripple down her spine. It was a violent, physiological reaction. The cold was a sculptor, chiseling away the soft edges of her composure, leaving only the hard, shivering core. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the raging sky. The lightning flashed, a strobe of harsh white light, and for a second, I saw the sheer exhaustion etched into her features. She looked like a statue left out in the rain, beautiful and eroding. She was stubborn. She stood there, chin lifted against the wind, refusing to ask for help, refusing to admit that her strategy had failed, that her armor was useless. She would stand there until she froze, rather than admit she needed something from me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and the professional scoreboard in my head wiped clean. The valuation didn't matter. The hostile takeover didn't matter. The fact that she had tried to fire my CFO last week felt like a memory from a different life. Right now, she was just a human being, shivering violently on my balcony, and I was the only one with the resources to stop it. The sight of her, wet and trembling yet fiercely unmoving, broke something in me. It broke the resolve to keep my distance. It broke the wall I had built to keep her out. I couldn't leave her like this. The cold was an enemy we could both agree on, and she was losing the fight. I turned back to the glass doors. Just inside, hanging on the valet hook like a sentry, was my winter coat. It was a heavy architectural piece, charcoal wool, lined in silk, designed for winters that bit back. I grabbed it, the weight of it substantial and reassuring in my hands, and stepped back out into the gale. Violet hadn't moved. She was vibrating now, the tremors visible even in the dark, a frantic frequency that shook the water from her hair. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't make it a transaction. I simply walked up behind her and opened the coat like a pair of wings. "Arms," I murmured, close to her ear, my voice pitched below the wind. She obeyed instinctively, a reflex born of exhaustion. She slid her arms into the sleeves, and I pulled the heavy wool up and over her shoulders. The effect was immediate. I settled the collar around her neck, my hands lingering for a fraction of a second near her throat. I felt the heat of my palms transfer through the layers, a deliberate grounding touch against the damp silk. Violet gasped, a sharp, broken sound as the weight of the coat settled on her. It wasn't just warmth. It was an anchor. She grabbed the lapels instantly, her pale, freezing fingers clutching the dark fabric and pulling it tight across her chest, sealing herself in. She buried her chin in the collar, inhaling deeply. "Cedar," she whispered into the wool. "And you." The scent was personal. My perfume, the wood of my closet, the faint, lingering trace of smoke. It enveloped her, creating a sensory link that was far more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. She was wearing my history now. She closed her eyes, and I watched the rigid tension drain out of her neck. The corporate posture collapsed into something softer, something human. "Come on," I said, my hand hovering near her elbow, guiding her without seizing control. "The sofa is deeper in the recess. It's out of the wind." We moved to the heavy outdoor sectional, pushed against the far wall of the terrace. It was a pocket of dry air in the wet world. We sat down, close enough that I could feel the radiant cold coming off her wet hair. The darkness here was profound, a velvet curtain that hid the wreckage of the city below. Violet pulled her legs up, tucking her heels beneath the hem of my coat. She looked like a refugee from a gala, wrapped in oversized wool, staring out at the rain. The energy between us changed. It wasn't the hostile tension of the boardroom anymore. It was the heavy, textured quiet of shared survival. "I haven't been this cold since I was a child," she admitted, her voice muffled by the collar. My father believed in building character through exposure. "He sounds charming," I remarked, watching the rain lash the railing. "He was effective," she corrected, but the bite was gone. "He taught me that comfort is a distraction, that if you're comfortable, you're not climbing." She turned to look at me, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "I've spent 20 years being uncomfortable, climbing. I dismantled 3 companies this year, doubled the fund's returns. And now you're freezing on a balcony with your rival," I finished. "Exactly." She let out a short, humorless laugh that vibrated in the quiet space. "The view from the top is supposed to be spectacular. Nobody tells you it's just windy and lonely," I added. She went quiet. The word hung in the damp air, heavy and undeniable. Loneliness was the overhead cost of our ambition. We both knew the specific isolation of the corner office, the way success acts as a filtration system until you're left with only employees and targets. "I thought you hated me," she said suddenly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. "I hate your strategy," I clarified. "I hate what you did to the logistics vertical. But I don't hate you." I looked at her, wrapped in my coat, her defenses literally stripped away by the rain. It's hard to hate someone when you're sharing a lifeboat. She looked down at the coat, running her thumb over the texture of the wool button. "This is warmer than anything I own," she whispered. "My armor is aesthetic. This is real." "It's just wool, Violet." "No," she shook her head, looking back at the storm. "It's weight. I forgot what it felt like to be held by something heavy." The admission was startling. Violet, the woman who cut ties and assets with surgical precision, admitting she craved weight. "Well," I said softly, leaning back against the cushions. "You're grounded now. You have to carry the weight for a while." "I suppose I do," she agreed. She shifted, and her shoulder pressed against mine. The heavy wool of the coat brushed against my arm, a rough, warm friction. She didn't pull away. She stayed there, anchored by the coat, letting the proximity settle between us like the dark. "Stay there," I commanded softly. The wind was still howling, but the immediate crisis of her freezing had passed. Now, we just had the long, dark stretch of the night to navigate. I stood up, the movement reluctant, leaving the warmth of the shared space for the interior gloom. I navigated the shadowed living room by memory, my bare feet finding the path to the bar cart. I didn't need light for this. I knew exactly where the bottle lived. It was a rare, single malt scotch, older than the company I had founded, kept for celebrations that never quite felt big enough to justify opening it. Tonight felt big enough. Not a celebration, perhaps, but an occasion. The cork came out with a soft, satisfying thwack that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet apartment. I grabbed 2 heavy crystal tumblers, their weight substantial and serious, and carried the survival kit back out to the terrace. Violet watched me return, her eyes tracking the bottle in the gloom. I sat back down, closer this time, the distance between us shrinking naturally, pulled tight by the gravity of the storm. I poured the amber liquid in the dark. I couldn't see the level, so I poured by sound, listening to the glug, glug, glug until the pitch changed. I handed her a glass. "To the grounded," she toasted, her voice low and husky. "To the storm," I replied. We drank. I watched her profile as she tipped the glass back. The movement was elegant, practiced. I saw the muscles in her throat work as she swallowed, a precise, rhythmic motion that felt strangely mesmerizing in the half-light. She didn't wince at the burn. She welcomed it, closing her eyes as the heat traveled down, thawing her from the inside out. "That," she exhaled, opening her eyes to look at me, "is not the cheap stuff." I was saving it for a merger, I admitted, swirling the liquid. But this seemed more pressing. The alcohol hit our empty stomachs and did exactly what it was designed to do. It dissolved the last of the filters. Sitting there in the dark, wrapped in wool and silence, the usual posturing felt exhausted. We stopped talking about our wins. We stopped reciting the resume of our successes. Instead, we started trading the wreckage. "I lost the Kincaid deal last quarter," she said suddenly. It was a confession she would never have made in daylight. I misread the founder. I thought he wanted money. He wanted a legacy. I offered him a check, and he walked away. "I know," I said. "I read the briefing. I thought you were ruthless." "I was arrogant," she corrected, taking another sip. "There's a difference. Ruthlessness is a tool. Arrogance is a blindfold." She turned to face me fully, tucking one leg up under the coat. "That's why I've been watching you," she murmured. "You don't have that blindfold. I've spent 6 months trying to find a structural weakness in your operations, and it's frustratingly solid. Your work has precision." The word hung in the air. Coming from Violet, who treated compliments like currency to be hoarded, it felt heavy. She wasn't flattering me to get a better price. She was acknowledging me as a peer. "I thought you were just trying to gut the valuation," I said, the admission quiet. "I thought you were a butcher." "I'm a venture capitalist, darling. We're all butchers," she said, but there was no bite in it. "But you build things that are hard to cut. I respect that. It's rare." "You're terrifying, you know that?" I told her. "The industry calls you the Reaper." She laughed then. It wasn't the polite, social laugh she used at galas to diffuse tension. It was a low, genuine sound that rumbled in her chest and vibrated in the small space between us. It was a dark, rich sound, full of genuine amusement. "The Reaper," she repeated, shaking her head. "God, I'm tired of being the villain. It takes so much energy to be scary." I looked at her. Really looked at her. In the shadows, the age gap between us was more apparent. Not in lines or wrinkles, but in the weight she carried. She had 5 years on me. 5 years of extra scars. 5 years of battles I hadn't fought yet. I had the hunger of someone still climbing the mountain. She had the weary, tempered steel of someone who had been holding the summit for too long. "You don't look scary right now," I whispered. "You just look real." "Don't tell anyone," she murmured, leaning her head back against the cushions. "It would ruin my valuation." We sat in the quiet again, but it was comfortable now, warmed by the whiskey and the truth. The storm raged on, but inside our little shelter, the air was settling into something heavier, something magnetic. We were just 2 women drinking in the dark, but the current running between us was strong enough to light the city. The storm had done something strange to the architecture of the penthouse. By extinguishing the city lights and turning the sky into a wall of solid, impenetrable black, it had transformed the sliding glass doors into a dark, expansive mirror. The view was gone. Instead of the skyline I had paid millions to possess, the glass now reflected only us. 2 figures huddled together on a deep sofa, wrapped in charcoal wool, suspended in a void. I found myself captivated by this ghostly duplicate of our reality. It was safer to look at the reflection than to look at the woman sitting inches away from me. In the glass, the image was slightly distorted, softened by the double-pane thermal layers and the streaks of rain lashing the exterior. It turned the scene into an oil painting, blurring the sharp edges of our rivalry. I watched the spectral version of Violet. In the reflection, she wasn't the terrifying venture capitalist who could freeze a boardroom with a raised eyebrow. She was a silhouette of exhaustion and elegance, her head resting back against the cushions, her eyes half closed. I watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of my own coat where it draped over her chest. It was a hypnotic motion, a visual metronome marking the time we were losing together. In the glass, I could study the arch of her neck, the way a wet strand of hair clung to her cheek like ink on parchment, and the relaxation of her hand where it rested near her mouth, still holding the tumbler of whiskey. It felt illicit, this observation. It was a stolen intimacy, a way to map the terrain of her face without the risk of being caught in the crossfire of her gaze. The dark mirror allowed for a bravery I didn't possess face to face. I traced the line of her jaw in the reflection, noting the tension that had finally begun to unspool. I looked at the way her legs were tucked up, defenseless. The rivalry that defined our daylight hours felt irrelevant here. The reflection showed two people who fit together in the negative space of the storm, two solitary elements combined into a single, complex compound. Then, the image in the glass changed. Violet's eyes opened. She didn't turn her head. She didn't break the pose. She simply lifted her gaze to the glass, and in the dark reflection, her eyes met mine. The breath caught in my throat. I should have looked away. The polite social contract demanded that I pretend I hadn't been staring, that I shift my focus to the non-existent horizon. But I didn't. And neither did she. We watched each other, watching ourselves. The indirect gaze stripped away the last layer of pretense. There was no way to hide the intensity of the look in the reflection. The glass captured it and threw it back at us with double the force. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and unblinking. She saw me studying her, and instead of the deflection or icy professionalism I expected, she offered a challenge. She held the contact, unflinching. It was a silent conversation, louder than the wind screaming around the pillars. She was acknowledging the shift, the sudden, heavy gravity that had pulled us from the opposite ends of the table to this shared square foot of wool and heat. The stillness on the balcony deepened, becoming thick and textured. The thrum of attraction was undeniable now, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to match the storm. It wasn't just the whiskey or the adrenaline of the blackout. It was the proximity. It was the realization that the person I had spent 6 months fighting was the only person who understood the specific frequency of this solitude. Then she moved. It was a small adjustment, a shifting of weight in the deep cushions, but in the stillness, it felt seismic. She uncurled her legs slightly beneath the heavy coat. Her knee drifted sideways, seeking a new position, and brushed against mine. The contact was electric. It wasn't a collision. It was a docking. Through the layers of her damp suit trousers and my cashmere joggers, the heat of her skin was a sudden, shocking reality. A polite stranger would have pulled back, muttered an apology, and reestablished the demilitarized zone. Violet did the opposite. She let her leg rest there, pressing firmly against mine. It was a deliberate breach of the perimeter. It was a question asked in bone and muscle. Are we doing this? The pressure of her knee against mine grounded me. It anchored the floating tension of the night into a single physical point of contact. My heart hammered against my ribs, a traitorous rhythm that I was sure she could feel through the coat. I didn't pull away. I leaned into the touch, returning the pressure, answering the question without a single word. The reflection in the glass showed us clearly now. Two women, no longer separate entities, but a single shape in the darkness. The distance was gone. The professional firewall had been breached. She turned her head then, tearing her gaze from the safety of the mirror to face me directly. The reflection was no longer enough. She wanted the real thing. She turned from the reflection to face me directly, and the safety of the indirect gaze shattered. The mirror had been a buffer, a way to observe the truth without consequences. But now she was looking at the real thing. The distance between us on the sofa was negligible, a few inches of wool and charged air, but the shift in her attention made it feel like we had crossed a border. The storm outside was still raging, battering the glass with gale-force winds. But inside the shelter of the balcony, the stillness was profound. The professional rivalry that had defined every interaction we'd ever had, the sharp emails, the icy nods at conferences, the brutal negotiations, evaporated. It didn't just fade. It was rendered obsolete by the immediate, crushing gravity of the moment. We weren't a founder and a VC anymore. We were two bodies seeking heat in a cold world. Violet didn't pull back. She leaned in, her eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom, searching my face with the same intensity she usually reserved for a due diligence report. But there was no calculation in her expression now, only a raw, terrifying openness. "You have a specific gravity," she murmured, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the small space between us. I thought I could dismantle it. I thought it was just branding. But the texture of this, of you in the storm, it's not something I can model. It was a sultry compliment, wrapped in the language of our trade, but delivered with the intimacy of a confession. She was admitting that her analysis had failed, that the reality of me was something she couldn't quantify. The air between us thickened, charged with the scent of the rain and the lingering peat of the whiskey. I didn't answer with words. The time for strategy was over. I reached out, my hand moving through the dark to find the line of her jaw. Her skin was cool, dampened by the mist and the night air, a stark contrast to the warmth of the coat. But as my palm settled against her cheek, I felt the heat rising beneath the surface to meet my touch. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat into the safety of her armor. She leaned into my hand, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, a silent surrender that hit me harder than the whiskey. "Violet," I whispered, the name feeling different now, stripped of its title. I closed the distance. It wasn't a frantic collision. It wasn't the desperate, messy fumbling of two people trying to outrun the fear of the storm. It was a slow, inevitable merger, a correction of an error we'd both been making for 6 months. When our lips met, it was with a precision that felt devastating. Her mouth was soft, warm, tasting faintly of smoke and the sweet, clean improvisation of the rain. It started as a question, a tentative pressure, a testing of the boundary, and answered itself instantly. Violet made a low sound in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own lips, and the last of her restraint snapped. Her hand came up, tangling into the hair at the nape of my neck, gripping tight. It was the same intensity she brought to the boardroom, but translated into touch. There was a desperate pressure to it, a need to anchor herself in the physical reality of the moment. We were two control freaks losing control simultaneously, and the relief was intoxicating. The kiss deepened, shifting from exploration to acclaim. I felt the tension in her shoulders finally break, her body softening against mine as she allowed the weight of the coat and the heat of the embrace to hold her up. The wind tore at the edges of our shelter, a chaotic, violent soundtrack, but it felt miles away. The only thing that mattered was the friction of the wool, the taste of her, and the way her breath hitched when I shifted closer, pressing her back against the cushions. We stayed there as the storm raged, locked in a coordinate that existed outside of time. The rain sprayed against our faces, cold and sharp, but it couldn't touch the heat we were generating. It was a breach of every protocol we had, a violation of the unspoken rules of our industry, and it was the only honest thing we had done all year. Eventually, the frantic energy of the collision began to settle. It didn't disappear, but it transmuted into something heavier, quieter. The adrenaline that had spiked with the blackout and the touch began to fade, replaced by a profound, heavy comfort. We didn't pull apart. We stayed wrapped in the charcoal wool, limbs tangled, breathing the same air. The night wore on, dark and wet, but the penthouse didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like the only place on earth. I woke to the light. It was aggressive, a sharp, relentless gold that sliced through the glass walls. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving behind a terrifyingly blue horizon. The city below was slowly rebooting. The hum of traffic returned, a low, rhythmic pulse that signaled the return of commerce, of strategy, of the world where we were enemies. I turned to the outdoor sofa. Violet was still asleep. The woman who could freeze a room with a single question was curled into the corner of the cushions, completely enveloped in my charcoal coat. Her face was pressed into the wool lapel. Her hair, usually perfect, was messy, drying in soft, chaotic waves. She looked younger. The tension that permanently etched the corners of her eyes was erased by sleep. She looked soft. It felt intrusive to see her like this, unguarded and safe, breathing the same air as me, without calculating the cost. Then the inevitable intrusion arrived. Her phone buzzed on the glass table. It was a single, sharp vibration, But in the quiet morning, it sounded like a gunshot. I glanced at the screen before she stirred. Flight plan cleared. Teterboro. Departure 0900. The spell broke. The noise woke her. She sat up, blinking against the glare, and for a split second, the raw intimacy of the night lingered in her gaze. She looked at me with a raw vulnerability that made my chest ache. Then she saw the notification. The mask slammed back into place. She straightened her spine, smoothed her ruined silk blouse, and reached for the leather briefcase. The Reaper was back online. "The weather is cleared," she said. Her voice was raspy from sleep, a husky sound that conflicted with the clinical statement. "I see that," I replied, standing up. The movement felt heavy. It was no longer the sanctuary of solitude I had curated. It felt empty, a glass cage that was suddenly too big for one person. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. The transition was jarring. We went from the shared woolen warmth of the balcony to the cold logistics of departure in seconds. We walked to the foyer. The marble floor was dry now. She didn't offer a handshake. That would be too formal. She didn't offer a hug. That would be too much. We stood there, two professionals in the morning light. But the armor didn't fit quite right anymore. It felt tight, restrictive, like putting on a suit that had shrunk in the wash. We were pretending, and we both knew it. "The valuation," she said, adjusting her trench coat, which had dried into stiff, unhappy wrinkles. "We'll discuss the revised terms on Tuesday." "Tuesday," I agreed, leaning against the wall. "Don't be late." She paused, her hand on the elevator call button. She looked at me, and her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes. It was a flicker of the mirror scene, a brief acknowledgement of the breach. "I'm never late. I was just diverted." "Safe flight, Violet." "Thank you," she murmured. "For the shelter." She stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing her away, severing the connection as cleanly as a wire cutter. I walked back out to the balcony. The city was loud now, indifferent to the night we had survived. I looked at the sofa. She had left the coat. It was draped over the chair where she had slept, a heavy charcoal shape retaining the form of her body. It wasn't an accident. Violet didn't make mistakes with assets. It was collateral, a token, a silent promise that she intended to return for it. I picked up the heavy charcoal wool. It still held the warmth of her skin, a ghost of the morning heat, and the faint, complex scent of santal mixed with the rain. The rivalry wasn't over, but it had mutated. We weren't just enemies anymore. We were accomplices. The boardroom would be different now. I knew the texture of her fear, and she knew the weight of my coat. If you've ever found clarity in the middle of a storm, tell me in the comments. Subscribe for more stories from the Penthouse.